I have a confession to make. For as popular and renowned as they are, I never played any of the original Silent Hill games. But Silent Hill is one of those titles that gets brought up when discussing good horror games. So, what makes a good horror game? Well, people have cited good atmosphere and theming, unpredictability, and if necessary, decent combat. Now, as for Cursed Mountain, well, the nicest thing I can say about it is it gets 1 out of 3 things correct.
Cursed Mountain is a Wii exclusive game released in 2009. It was developed by Sproing Interactive Media and published by Deep Silver. Sproing is an Austrian game developer whose resume up until this point doesn't include anything of note, although according to their Wikipedia page, they developed several Mohun games. Now, for those who didn't grow up in German-speaking countries, Mohun was a casual game where you had to shoot as many of these flying chickens within 90 seconds. The game was originally never intended for wider release and was only playable on laptops distributed to bars. When a copy of the game was leaked online, Mohun's popularity exploded and has since spawned over 40 different games on just about every platform imaginable. Before there was Angry Birds, there was Mohun. But am I here to talk about cartoon chickens or horror games? Let's get back on subject. At the time of release, I distinctly remember a commercial touting that Cursed Mountain was the scariest game ever on the Wii. It piqued my interest back then, but I never got around to picking it up. I was probably too busy playing Super Smash Bros. Brawl back then.
And 10 years later, I'm glad that I didn't. Not because I can't handle horror games, but it's because you need the patience of a monk to finish this game. Holy shit, I've never played a game with more unresponsive controls. This game is a prime example of why motion controls suck.
Your character moves at a snail's pace, and the fastest he can go is a light jog, meaning that a level takes an eternity to traverse. But that's the least of my gripes. My main gripe with this game is the combat. It is, without question, the worst combat I have ever encountered in a game. Yeah, even worse than Devil's Third. Your main weapon is an ice axe that's been enchanted so it can hit ghosts. You press B to attack whatever's directly in front of you, and along the way, you collect various different artifacts that can shoot projectiles. For this, you hold down the C button and press B to fire. Sounds simple enough, so what's the problem? Well, when you hurt a ghost and leave him with just a sliver of health, you can banish them by holding the C button and pressing A. Then, the game prompts you to swing the Wiimote or nunchuck in a certain direction, and this is where the problem lies. Half the time, it doesn't work, especially if you're prompted to move the Wiimote up. What you're not seeing in this footage is me flailing my arm up and down to get the game to respond. I mean, come the fuck on, how is it not registering? But the worst part about this combat is the fact that it didn't need to be here, because a good horror game doesn't need combat. Okay, let me repeat that. A good horror game doesn't need combat, especially if all it does is take away from the overall experience. You want a prime example? Just look at Amnesia: The Dark Descent. In that game, you can't even look at the monsters chasing you, or else your sanity meter falls. There's nothing you can do in that game except hiding and hoping that they go away. This is far scarier than actually fighting whatever is chasing you. But in Cursed Mountain, the combat isn't even implemented properly. The awkward and slow movements, coupled with the motion controls, makes it feel like any time you get hit was because of something beyond your grasp. It's not that this game is hard, considering that I only died a handful of times, but every time there was combat, I dreaded having to deal with the motion controls yet again. Look, if you're going to have combat in a survival horror game, do it well or don't do it at all.
Of course, a game like this is story-driven, and while it's not the worst story I've encountered in a game, it definitely dragged on longer than it should have. So grab a cup of hot chocolate, make yourself comfortable, because it's story time with Marlowe. I'm going to tell you the story of this game from start to finish.
The plot involves two mountaineering brothers, Eric and Frank Simmons. Frank, the younger brother, goes missing under mysterious circumstances on an expedition to Mount Chomolungma, located in Tibet. You control Eric Simmons and have to uncover the mystery surrounding your brother's disappearance and hopefully bring him back alive.
Climbing log. 16,800 feet. Lando is the highest city in the world. The gateway to the Himalayas. It's a religious city, ruled by the monks of the Chod sect of the Buddhist religion, and home to the intensely superstitious Sherpas, the toughest, most skilled climbing guides in the world. But now, this normally bustling city is deserted. The stores are shuttered, the streets bare. I had to bribe a truck driver to bring me here, and no amount of money could persuade him to actually enter the city. Something has caused the Sherpas to flee their beloved mountain, which will only make it harder for me to find my brother Frank.
Eric meets up with Bennett, the organizer of the expedition. He explains that Frank and his climbing partner Paul scaled Mount Chomolonzo to retrieve an artifact called a terma, an ancient piece of Buddhist scripture that supposedly grants immortality.
Either these ghosts are real, and your whole worldview just got knocked into a hat, or there's some kind of high-altitude hallucination. So, Bennett tried for the terma. Lost his leg in an accident, and hired Frank to go after the terma for him. And now he's been scared off by a ghost. So I guess it's time for me to get cracking and find that monastery.
Eric makes his way up the mountain to an abandoned village. There he meets Jomo Menmo, a shaman who helped Frank prepare for his climb, along with her apprentice, Migma. She convinces Eric to follow her to a ritual site to help find Frank, but after realizing who Eric is, she pushes him down a cliff.
I'm here.
Brother, steal Migma. Rape Goddess Mother. Your blood to pay.
Of course he survives the fall, because otherwise there would be no game to play. So Eric has to make his way back up to the village, but encounters this crow spirit. I guess it's supposed to be the spirit of death of the mountain? I don't know. And this is the point of the game where you realize this game has boss fights.
Okay, real talk. Why did they do this? Like, who looked at the combat and thought it was decent and polished enough to include boss fights? It's frustrating enough to fight the regular enemies, now they want to include boss fights? What demon possessed the developers to go forth with this?
Eventually, Eric makes his way back up to Jomo Menmo's tent, where we have to fight the bird spirit again.
Climbers log. 18,200 feet. I'm in the terraced fields above Cherku, heading for Nyen Book Monastery. I'm hoping to find Lama Todpa up there. Meanwhile, the valley below is covered in mist. Hard to believe that everyone down there is dead.
Next stop is Nyende Kibuk Monastery, where Eric meets Todpa, a monk keeping the ghosts at bay. And it is here, nearly 3 hours of gameplay later, where we finally get some background on what transpired.
A year ago, I was studying in the monastery library when a trick of the light revealed that the ancient manuscript I was reading was actually a palimpsest, a scroll that had been written on, scraped off, and used again. What lay underneath was a breathtaking discovery. The location of an ancient terma. A terma is a key piece of wisdom that was written down in ancient times and magically hidden until such future time as the wisdom is needed. Only then does the terma come again to the light. I could not decipher the entire scroll, and so I brought it to Master Lama Kenpo Jigme Lingpa for him to study. But in the meantime, I also told my good friend Edward Bennett what I had found, and that the terma lay waiting to be collected high on the sacred one. Bennett could not wait for the remainder of the scroll to be translated. Impetuously, he embarked on a solo climb to retrieve the Terma and suffered a terrible accident that resulted in the loss of his leg. By the time Bennett had recovered, Master Kenpo had deciphered the rest of the text. It was a prophecy about the man who would bring the Terma down from the mountain. When I read the prophecy to Bennett, he immediately said that the words applied to your brother. Bennett brought your brother here and prepared him to climb the mountain. There were mundane preparations, of course, but also sacred ones. Normally, one cannot climb Chomolonzo unless one has journeyed on foot around the base of the mountain 12 times. Such a journey is known as a Kora. Of course, Frank had not completed these Koras. But Bennett persuaded Jomo Menmo's apprentice to perform a series of sacred rituals that would appease the goddess and allow Frank to approach her. The apprentice was a young girl named Mingma Yangzi. Something must have gone wrong. The day after Frank left camp, ghosts and demons started to appear. The Sherpas fled. My fellow monks fled. They have run away from the goddess for the very reason that you approach her.
Now I know that keeping the player in ignorance is part of what makes horror games scary, but considering that Eric met this monk at the beginning of the game as well, why couldn't he just explain everything there and then? And why reveal all this backstory at once? Had the game taken a more methodical approach and have Eric investigate everything, slowly revealing what happened, that would make for a much scarier experience.
Throughout the game, you do get a sense of what happened through these diary entries you can pick up. I suppose it's a neat addition, adding a more investigative element to the game. But it seems pointless now that we know what happened. The diary entries are just collectibles for the sake of having collectibles. They should have had these diary entries be essential items and make the player slowly piece together what happened. Oh, and while they're at it, remove the damn combat. And speaking of combat, this chapter, Chapter 4, was also one of the most infuriating moments of the game. First, you have to retrieve individual lines for a mantra by navigating your way through this burial ground full of invisible obstacles. That's not the annoying part. The aggravation begins when you enter this temple and you need to chant by waving the Wiimote around in a circular motion. Next, you have to fight this ghost, which I failed at several times. Why? Well, first I thought you just fight it like any other enemy, by hitting it until it's dead. But no, you have to use this artifact that you picked up earlier in the same room, which allows you to kill it. And if you die, you go all the way back to the burial ground and have to do the chanting all over again. Why couldn't this artifact just be given to you when the fight starts? It's just not intuitive at all. Anyway, Todpa explains that Frank's spirit has entered the Bardo, the intermediate stage between death and rebirth. Yet he also explains that there's a slight chance that he can return. So he tells Eric to meet Kenpo Jingmei Lingpa, the abbot of the Digaigonchen Monastery.
Climber's log. 18,700 feet. Right below Digaigonchen. Biggest monastery in the entire province. Library jammed with centuries of wisdom. But I need to find the abbot, Kenpo Jingmei Lingpa. He's the one who will help me find Frank.
After Eric fights his way through the monastery and finds Kenpo Jingmei Lingpa, this next chapter takes place in the Bardo. And this is where the game jumps the shark, because this chapter has a boss fight against this thing. What even is this thing? Up until now, the ghosts and spirits were pretty standard. The only outlandish one was the bird spirit, but I reckon it still falls within the realms of this game. But this thing, whatever it's called, looks like a rejected monster design from Bayonetta, and even that's being extremely generous. Or am I being insensitive here? Does this creature appear in Buddhist scripture? You tell me. Oh, and fighting this thing is just as annoying as you'd think. At first I thought you're supposed to hit it, but no, that'd be too obvious. You have to make it hit these orange barriers a couple times to break free. Now you can attack it up close or with your ranged attack. After using Banish on it 3 times, it then starts to jump around, but after a few attacks, it's gone. Once you figure out the patterns, it's not a hard boss fight at all, but I managed to die nearly a dozen times because I couldn't figure out what the hell to do. There's nothing obvious that tells you how to fight this thing, and the clues you're given are unhelpful. This entire chapter and boss fight feels like padding to artificially lengthen the game, because once you're finished, you're taken straight back to where you were, sitting next to Kempo, who simply tells you you're ready to climb the sacred one.
Seriously, what did Eric learn from being in the Bardo? The fact that he can defeat a 6-armed salamander man? I never thought I'd see a boss fight, the thing that in most games is used as a pivotal plot point, used as padding. Like, what did this boss fight add to the overall game experience? Nothing. In fact, I'd say it took away from the game experience because all it did was made me angry and made me wish this game was over sooner.
Now that Eric is ready to climb Chomolonzo, he makes his way to the base camp. However, along the way, he finds the body of Migma.
Mingma Yangza. Perform rituals with Frank. Sexual.
You're beautiful.
Take amulet to her lover, not Frank. Paul Ward. Bennett. Killed her. Why?
There's another fight with the spirit, but as soon as it's defeated, Eric falls down another cliff. Which he survives just fine, because apparently Eric Simmons is made of rubber. At the bottom of the chasm, he finds a walkie-talkie, and Paul, Frank's climbing partner, is on the other side. This leads to a section of the game where Paul is giving you directions on how to get out of the chasm through the walkie-talkie. Now, you can't hear the audio in the capture because the instructions come through the little speaker on the Wiimote, which makes it sound all compressed, as if he was really talking to you over a radio. It's a nice addition to the game. I just wished it was incorporated into more parts of it, and not just this one section.
And furthermore, how is Paul able to tell Eric's location? It's not been established that Eric is carrying a GPS beacon on him, and I doubt that there's a map available for the network of tunnels, so how the hell does Paul know Eric's location? This game is too unrealistic.
The horrors continue at base camp as the place is infested with ghosts. Eric finds Paul and Bennett, who gets shocked at the sight of Migma's amulet. Bennett pushes Paul off a cliff and then transforms into a demon. You know what that means? Another boss fight.
Fetch me the Terma or die.
Go to hell, you bastard.
Well, thankfully this one's a lot easier as Bennett acts more like a regular ghost, so you can hit him and banish him like any other enemy.
Using oxygen now. Not enough at base camp. So I'm already low.
The next chapter has you climbing to the summit of Mount Chomolonzo, but you have to make sure that you have enough oxygen. Now, I would tell you what happens when you run out, but oxygen tanks were so abundant that I was never in any real danger of running out. Yet another interesting but ultimately pointless game mechanic. At this point I'm thinking, okay, this has to be the final chapter. This has to be the part where Eric finally reaches the summit and finds Frank. But no, there's still one more chapter. Like, how much more can they drag this out? It's not like much happens in this chapter that's crucial to the plot. It's just a bunch of walking and fighting. I mean, there is this cutscene where we see this dialogue exchange between Frank and Paul, but it's nothing we don't already know. Furthermore, the final chapter only takes about 20 minutes to complete, so why couldn't they just condense the 2 chapters into one? The final chapter is nothing more than just climbing, running, occasionally fighting until you reach the top, where Eric finds the Terma and Frank, but has to fight the demon of the mountain to save him.
You think of Buddhism as a religion of peace. Did you never wonder why all our monks learned to fight?
And apparently the demon of the mountain can speak perfect English.
Although quite imposing, this fight isn't too hard either, but I was so sick of the terrible motion controls that I audibly groaned when I saw what the finale of this game was. Once the demon is down, Eric opens the terma to banish the demon back to the bardo, and then the game ends with this laughably pretentious cutscene.
The curse is lifted. Go in peace.
Come on, Frank. Let's get out of here.
I'm not going.
Don't be an idiot. You're sick. We're both sick. It's the altitude. We'll get back down, and everything will be set right.
Why do we do it, Eric? Why do we climb mountains? Is it to get away from ourselves? Or to find our true self? My true self isn't pretty, big brother. I've learnt what I can from this life. It's time to move on and try again.
I'm bloody well not leaving you here.
You've always felt the weight, haven't you? The responsibility to take care of me. Eric Simmons to the rescue. Isn't that what you used to say? Well, you can lay that down now. You've done well. Mum and Dad would be proud. Goodbye, Eric.
Climbing log. 27,500 plus feet. I don't know how much of this is real, but I know Frank is where he belongs. Whatever the terma is, the prophecy was wrong. The world is not ready for its power. I'll leave the goddess to protect her own.
I wish I was wrong about this game. I wish that I could have recommended it as an underrated classic on the Wii's shovelware-filled library. But no, I really can't. And I feel bad, because I do really like the theming of this game. The Buddhist temples, mountaineering camps, being isolated on a snowy mountain, they're all great settings for a decent horror game. And given the characters' slow movements and the investigative nature of the game, this game could have been a decent point-and-click style game. That way, they can incorporate the Wii's motion controls without the need of implementing a clumsy combat system. Oh well, I guess I shouldn't judge a game on what it could have been, and instead, take an honest look at this game. Well, Cursed Mountain is a mediocre horror game that has great theming but is mechanically flawed. It controls awkwardly and the combat is clumsy. Not recommended.
I recognize you. The vision. That's impossible.
Perhaps you are recalling a photograph of me that you saw when you met Todpa.
To begin with, the controls suck. Let's just nip that in the bud right now. As you can see, it's a 3D action game. Now tell me, what do you expect the controls to be? Most likely you'll say left analog stick to move and right analog stick to control the camera. That's a standard for most games of the sort. Being able to control the camera is a golden rule for 3D games that's been established since way back in 1996 with Mario 64. So when I moved the right analog stick to adjust the camera in Knack and found myself dodging, I honestly thought my controller was broken. Why would you make the right analog stick do anything other than control the camera? Why couldn't dodging be the shoulder buttons? I mean, for fuck's sake, even that piece of shit game Devil's Third at least got the control scheme correct.